Hi there, it's Gabrielle Nicolay from SpeechKids, and today we are going to talk about bilingualism and how raising a bilingual child interacts with speech and language development. And so I made some notes because I feel like this is a super important topic. I don't want to forget to leave anything out. And I'm going to do this one in two parts. So today, what I want you to get a sense of is why you might choose to raise a child bilingually. And if you speak another language other than English and you're living in an English-speaking country, you probably already have this information, but it never hurts to repeat it. I also want to share some information about why being bilingual is a good thing. And there's some really interesting research out there about the kinds of benefits, neurological benefits that being bilingual gives a person. And then I want to talk to you about two approaches to raising bilingual kids. And the most important thing, and I meant to say this first and I forgot, of course, being bilingual does not cause speech and language delays. And we're going to talk about that more in depth, but just stick that in your brain. Being bilingual doesn't cause a delay in anything. If there's a delay, it's being caused and maybe exacerbated by something else. Okay, so being bilingual can maybe be a little bit more complicated if you have a speech and language delay. More on that in a second. So if you are living in the United States and you are a native speaker of another language, you might decide to raise your children in a bilingual environment. And the reason why you probably should do that if you're a native speaker of another language besides English and you're living in an English-speaking country is because you are going to be most comfortable in your native language. And when we are dealing with our children, we don't want any barriers between them and us. We don't want any linguistic, emotional, anything else between us and them. And I see that some of you are agreeing with me there, right? You need to be fully yourself in your relationship with your child. And if you are working to figure out the words to speak with your child, that's not going to happen. The most important thing, even if we're talking about how nice it is to raise bilingual kids, the most important thing is your relationship with your child. So I started out talking about non-native speakers of English. The flip side is true though. So if you are a native speaker of English and you think it would be really nice to raise bilingual children, you want to be a little bit careful because again, you don't want anything to get in the way of your emotional attachment and relationship with your child. So, okay, and this is such a big topic. I'm trying to sort of keep it narrowed down in a way. The other scenario is, and I'm using English just because that's what we're speaking here, okay? But the other scenario is you're an English speaker overseas. And so you have the opportunity where you are in the language minority, right? So you're speaking one language at home. The dominant culture is speaking a different language. And so you have an opportunity there to, again, keep that attachment with your child, use your native language with your child. Okay. Why are we going to do this? There is some, again, really interesting research about bilingualism and neurology at this point, and everything points to advantage. Advantage in how flexibly we see the world. Oh, thanks, guys. Thanks, Katina, for mentioning. Attachment is at the heart of all of this. Katina's saying, I like how you relate to attachment. If you don't have attachment with your child, you don't have anything. And so we can talk about speech and language all day long up here, but we've got to have that relationship with our child, right? We've got to have it. And it's the most important thing. And I never want therapy. I never want bilingualism. I never want academics. We can get there someday, to come between a parent and their child. So thank you for being on board with me there. But in terms of kids growing up bilingual, they're more flexible. They see more solutions to the same problem. They have, in some cases, and again, these are all studies, right, that have been done, so nothing's true of everybody, better social skills, better understanding for the other. And I think in today's political climate, that goes a long, long way. If we can raise some people who are more understanding of somebody who's different from us. And so there's all these neurological benefits. They do better in school, again, advantage after advantage for kids who are able to learn. And I'm saying bilingual, obviously trilingual is a thing, multilingualism is a thing, okay? But we're going to keep it simple for now because it's complicated enough. And so it is of tremendous benefit if you speak another language other than the majority language of your where you live, to impart that to your child, and it's free, right? If you're a native speaker of another language living in the States, that's, one language class you don't have to give your child, because you can give it to them for free. I want to tell you about 2 ways in which you can do this. So one is in which one parent is the foreign language speaker, right? And so you're going to do one person, one language. Otherwise, we sometimes call it one face, one language, right? So in my family, for example, my husband is a native speaker of Spanish. I am not. So we decided, and this was a conversation we had before the kids were born. We decided he was going to speak only Spanish to the kids. And it did feel a little artificial at first, and then it got completely normal. Like I would say within 6 weeks, it got just how it was. And so he only spoke Spanish to our kids. He only speaks Spanish to our kids. I only speak English to our kids. And I think the advantage there is I understand enough Spanish to know what he's talking about. But truth be known, when their kids are little, everything is pretty much context, right? So you can follow most of the time. And so that's how it went. So that's one person, one language. The other way you can do this, if you've got 2 native speakers at home, so say you are, and Katina's asking a great question, which I'll get to in a second. If you are 2 native speakers at home, you might do the minority language at home approach, right? Where you're speaking, for example, only Spanish at home, which is how my husband grew up because both of his parents were Spanish speakers. And then you speak English in the bigger world, right? And so you can raise a bilingual child that way. Katina's asking, do you ever translate for the kids? Yeah, so I want you to come back on Friday in the next video and ask me the same question, because I am definitely going to talk about some practical strategies to get your children speaking the language that you want them to speak, even when everybody else around them is not. And there are some concrete strategies that I'm going to give you to do that. And so that's a great follow-up question for the next video, but I'm going to make you wait till Friday. And so these are such good questions. Oh my gosh. Okay, so when we visit grandma, she speaks Greek. So do we keep the same concept there too, right? She speaks Greek. Yeah. That's a little bit harder because if your kids are not speaking Greek at home, chances are they're going to be understanding some Greek, but not necessarily speaking some Greek. So, Katina, I want you to hang on to those two questions and come back to me and I'll write them up too for Friday, because those are practical implementation things that I want to talk about in my next video. Because I think parents have the best intentions and then they get a little stuck with the approach. And it gets hard because they're getting pushback from their kids. So I want to definitely come back to that. Thank you. Okay. So we talked about two different ways in which you can do this, right? You can do minority language at home, and you can do one face, one language. Okay, so those are two things. Those are ways in which kids become simultaneously bilingual. In other words, both languages are introduced from birth, okay? And that is really the easiest way to do it. It's not the only way to do it, but that is the easiest way to do it, because they're sponges, right? The younger you are, the more of a sponge you are. And it's not at all that nobody can learn a different language, even after age 10, and people throw around age 10 as like some magic number. It's not. Certainly neural plasticity is a thing, right? Like kids have an easier time learning the younger they are, before they've weeded out all the sounds that they don't recognize automatically. So all that to say, if you could do it from birth, so much the better. If you can't, that's fine. No big deal. That's more of a sequential bilingual thing. And so, for example, my kids go to a bilingual school, and there are children who enter that school in kindergarten not speaking Spanish. So it's a dual immersion Spanish-English program, which we're super lucky to have. And so you get a 5-year-old who comes in to a Spanish environment. They've never spoken Spanish. They are going to have a learning curve, right? Because they're getting used to something new. And sometimes what we see, again, with sequential kids who are learning bilingual, becoming bilingual sequentially, is that they undergo this silent period, which is, I'm taking it in, it's marinating, I'm processing, and at some point they will begin to speak. So they may understand more than they speak at first, and then eventually what we look for is for that to even out. It is a red herring to think that a child who is late in speaking, particularly somebody who's being raised in a simultaneous bilingual environment, right, where both languages are being introduced from birth, being bilingual from birth does not cause a speech or a language delay. We look for the same milestones when we have a child who is bilingual as we do for a child who is monolingual. They should have the same number of words. They should be acquiring the same types of words. We want to look for a variety, right? We want nouns and verbs and location and I almost said expletives. We don't want expletives. Exclamations. Right? Look, mama is what we look for. And whether it comes out mira mami or look mama is completely irrelevant. But the words are there. Now, the technical thing that happens is sometimes people don't count all of the words. In other words, a child might have a word for, and I'm going to use Spanish just because that's what I'm most familiar with. You can apply this to any other language, okay? The child may know the word for cat in Spanish, which is gato, okay? So they use gato in all the situations, right? So when you're counting up the number of words that your child says, you want to include everything in both languages. And that's, I think, where people get a little stuck, which is, or maybe where they start to sort of technically think that their child has a delay, and they just don't. as long as your child has a map to the things in their environment, it doesn't matter what language it's in early on. Once they get to be 3, 4, that starts to split, and we look for like population of each language. So there is no downside to teaching your child 2 languages, and teaching your child 2 languages does not cause a language or a speech delay. But I'm the speech therapist, so I got to talk to you about kids who might have a speech and language delay. And I think kids who are bilingual, they get a pass too often because they're bilingual and have a speech and language delay. Okay, so I think it can be harder for professionals to recognize bilingual kids who have a speech and language delay, because they have some underlying assumptions that are maybe incorrect. And so I always want to say, right, being bilingual, again, if you haven't heard me yet, doesn't cause a speech delay, but it might mask one. And so if you're the parent of a child who's growing up bilingual, you really want to be a squeaky, squeaky, squeaky wheel. And you do not want to listen to a pediatrician or a teacher or a nanny or anybody else who tells you that being bilingual, it's fine because they're being raised in a bilingual environment. If you're noticing that your child is not meeting speech and language milestones and they're bilingual, don't listen to people who say that it's nothing. Okay? Again, being bilingual doesn't cause a speech and language delay, but again, it might mask one. So I just want parents to I want you to feel really empowered to push back against people who say, well, it's expected because they're being raised bilingual. No, it's not expected. If it's happening, if your child is having trouble learning to speak, if your child is frustrated when they try to express themselves, if your child doesn't understand or act in a way that shows that they understand what you're saying, that's more than what particular language they're speaking. And chances are, here's your litmus test, chances are it's happening in both languages, right? If it's happening in both, there's an underlying, and I call it language capital L issue or speech going on, right? If it's happening in both. If one language is soaring ahead and the other language is not, you might take a minute to sort of evaluate what's going on, right? Because kids need equal time. They need equal time, they need equal quality in each language, and they need equal experiences in order to make sense of the world. That's how we learn, right? We want to have, if you're making Play-Doh, your child needs to have that experience. If you're talking about the Play-Doh in that moment, your child is learning words that go with Play-Doh. If you're speaking about Play-Doh in English, your child is learning English words that have to do with Play-Doh. You want to make sure that you then bridge the gap and talk about those same words, those same concepts in your other language with respect to the Play-Doh, right? So you have to bridge. Here you go. Here's the speech therapist drawing you a picture. You have to bridge that experience and map it onto both sets of words, if that makes sense. And thank you for being in there with me as I try to muck through this very, very complicated topic, and yet it's so important, especially when we're all so connected. Yeah. So, okay. I'm just looking at my notes to make sure I have covered. There's no difference. Between monolingual language development and bilingual language development in terms of the quantity and the quality of what's coming out. The other distinction I wanted to make is the difference, and this has more to do with sequential bilinguals than simultaneous. But there's a difference between the language that we need in our interpersonal lives and the language that we need at school when we're learning content. And so If you speak another language, chances are you are conversational in that language. Again, unless you're a native speaker, if you learned it at school, chances are you're conversational, but you don't have any academic or subject matter vocabulary or knowledge or comfort. It's very few people. When people tell me that they are bilingual, oftentimes there's an imbalance, particularly in adulthood. So it's just something to consider. Obviously, if we're dealing with itty bitties who are just learning language, all of that is interpersonal, right? We're just learning how to make our needs and wants met and be in relationship with those around us. Once kids get to school is when the academic stuff really starts to happen, obviously. And even that, third grade. Third grade is when we stop learning to read and start reading to learn. And that's where the content and the academic material really comes into play. So I just wanted to point that out because it is, it's just something to consider. Again, if you're talking about a child who is bilingual, at what level are they bilingual, right? And what are you going for as a parent? Do you want your child to be able to talk to grandma? Do you want your child to be able to go and work in a foreign country? Because those are two very different goals with two very different sets of language needs. And again, that might seem a little overwhelming when you've got a 1-year-old and you're thinking about the adult that they will be. But it's worth spending a little bit of time up front if you're deciding whether or not to raise your kids bilingual and sort of how you're going to do that. So those are the mechanics. Next time, in part 2, we are going to talk about some firm practical strategies that you can use with, and I find that these strategies come into play mostly with like the 2.5 to 5-year-olds when they're realizing what's going on. And it's kind of a great time. I'll tell you some funny stories next time in the second part of this series. So getting your kids not just to understand what you're saying, but use the language that you want them to use. We're going to talk about the importance of consistency and then how to playfully encourage your children to speak their second language. So that's coming up in our next series. Great questions today. Thank you. And I will see you next time. Bye-bye.